My parents saved the neighbor's kids in a snowstorm but left me and my sister behind with pets. My name is Sutton Vance, and I was 18 years old the night my parents decided that the neighborhood's perception of them was worth more than my sister's life or my own. In Silverthorne, Colorado, a snowstorm isn't just weather, it's a trial of survival, and as the winds began to scream at 60 miles per hour, my father, Silas, chose his role as the town's hero over his role as a protector. I remember the clinical coldness in his eyes as he ushered our neighbor, Chloe Gable, and her two toddlers into our heated SUV. There was no room for us, my mother Beatrice claimed, with a practiced sigh of sacrifice, yet there was plenty of room for Chloe's designer luggage. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. Silas didn't just leave us. He ensured we were trapped, nailing plywood over the windows from the outside, while I stood shivering with my 8-year-old sister, Tessa, and our two terrified dogs. He told me it was to secure the perimeter, but the sound of the hammer against the wood felt like a coffin being sealed. Before the taillights disappeared into the whiteout, he flipped the main breaker, plunging us into a darkness so absolute it felt like an erasure. I spent the next 24 hours in that freezing silence, holding Tessa's hand while she struggled to breathe through her asthma, listening to the house groan under the weight of the ice. They thought they were leaving me behind to guard their assets, but in that pitch-black hallway, I found something they'd spent years trying to hide. My father signed our death warrant, like a man canceling a subscription, but he forgot that a storm always leaves a trail of wreckage, and I was about to make sure he was the one buried under it. That freezing silence in the hallway wasn't a new sensation. It was the familiar soundtrack of my entire life, just turned up to a deafening volume. As I sat there in the dark, feeling the phantom weight of the plywood my father had hammered over the exits, I realized that the cold biting into my skin was merely a physical manifestation of the emotional climate I had been raised in. You see, in the Vance household, love wasn't a gift, it was a currency, and I had been born into a permanent state of bankruptcy. My parents, Silas and Beatrice, were 19 when they had me a mistake that Silas never let me forget was the reason he had to trade his dreams for a paycheck at the county maintenance department. I wasn't their daughter, I was the debt they never finished paying. By the time I was 7, I understood that my existence was a line item on a ledger where the numbers were always in the red. While Silas was out building his reputation as the man who could fix anything in Silverthorne, I was the one thing at home he treated as broken beyond repair. My mother, Beatrice, was the architect of this domestic hierarchy. She was a woman who navigated the world through a lens of appearances, a woman who could smile at a church potluck while whispering a devastating critique of my difficult face into my ear as she straightened my collar. She taught me the art of the quiet sacrifice, a toxic curriculum designed to ensure that my needs never cast a shadow on the family's public shine. The contrast became even more surgical when my cousin Parker entered the frame. Parker was the son Silas actually wanted the second chance at a legacy that I had allegedly ruined just by being born. When Parker turned 16, Silas bought him a used Dodge Ram, claiming a boy needed independence to find his way in the world. That same year, I was told that walking 3 miles home from the weather station in the biting Colorado wind-built discipline, I would watch that truck's taillights disappear down the driveway, the heater probably humming, while I tightened my scarf and started the long trek through the slush. It wasn't about the truck, it was about the leash Silas used to keep me in my place, a leash made of duty and gratitude for the roof over my head that I was constantly reminded I hadn't earned. Beatrice was even more precise in her manipulations. She spent years grooming me to be a martyr for her social standing. Every time Silas had a rough patch, or Parker got into trouble with his grades, it was my job to absorb the fallout. "Sutton, be the bigger person," she would say, her voice like syrup laced with arsenic. What she really meant was, "Sutton, be the invisible person." She would take the small amounts of money I earned from my part-time internship at the meteorology office, claiming it was for the family fund, only to later see Parker wearing a new North Face jacket that cost exactly what I had worked 40 hours to earn. When I finally dared to ask why, the response was always a clinical reminder of the $214,000 my childhood heart surgery had allegedly cost them a number Silas kept filed in his mind like a weaponized invoice. I grew up believing I was a burden, a cost-prohibitive accident in a world of planned investments. My sister Tessa's arrival 8 years later should have changed things, but Silas and Beatrice simply saw her as a chance to get it right this time, provided I did the heavy lifting. I became Tessa's primary caregiver, while Silas was playing the public hero, and Beatrice was organizing gala dinners for the town's elite. I was the one who learned the specific rhythm of Tessa's wheezing, the one who kept her inhaler in my pocket like a talisman, while our mother forgot her daughter's pediatrician appointments because she was too busy helping vulnerable families like the Gables. The most devastating part of this architecture of deception was how they convinced me that this was normal. I didn't hate them then. I pined for them. I spent 18 years trying to earn a seat at a table that was never built for me. I thought if I got straight A's, if I became a lead intern, if I was the perfect, silent daughter, Silas might finally look at me, with the same pride he reserved for the town's mayor. But I was so busy admiring the hero frame Silas wore in public that I forgot to look at the rot inside it. As I sat on that closet floor in the dark, the snow piling up against the boarded-over windows, the duty I had carried like a lead weight finally began to snap. The family I had been told everything was currently miles away, in a warm hotel room, probably laughing with Chloe Gable, while my 8-year-old sister shivered in my arms. The truth was no longer a quiet, ugly thing in the corner of the room. It was the storm itself, howling through the rafters, stripping away the lies. My father hadn't left me behind to guard the house. He had left me because, in his cold, calculated ledger, I was the only asset he considered expendable. But as I reached for the manila folder I'd hidden under my floorboards, the one my grandmother had whispered about before she died, I realized that Silas Vance had made a fatal error. He thought he had locked me in the dark to keep me quiet, but all he did was give me the silence I needed, to finally start listening to the truth. In that suffocating darkness of the hallway, clutching Tessa's small, trembling hand, the architecture of our family's injustice finally stood revealed, stripped of the beautiful wallpaper Beatrice usually used to hide the cracks. For years, I had navigated our home, like a servant in a house I was told I was lucky to even stand in. This wasn't a sudden betrayal, it was a systematic, calculated distribution of worth that had been refined long before the first snowflake fell. In the Vance household, there was a strict, unspoken ledger. Silas and Beatrice were the board of directors. The neighbors were the valued clients. My cousin Parker was the golden investment, and I was the overhead. The disparity wasn't just a feeling. It was etched into the physical reality of our living space. While Parker occupied the spacious guest suite on the second floor, renovated with the inheritance Silas claimed was for the family's future, Tessa and I were relegated to the converted attic above the drafty garage. My father's excuse was always about character building and learning the value of space, yet the pipes in our room frequently froze, a detail he was too busy to fix while he was busy installing a brand new, high-efficiency furnace for Chloe Gable down the road. He called it community outreach. I called it what it was. A man buying public adoration with the time and comfort he stole from his own daughters. Money was the primary tool of my containment. Every cent I earned at the meteorology station was funneled into a family savings account that I was never allowed to see, let alone access. Beatrice would sit at the mahogany desk in the library, a room I was barely permitted to enter, and explain with clinical precision how my earnings were merely a contribution toward the enormous deficit my existence had created. She kept a binder of every medical bill from my childhood, every grocery receipt, even the cost of the electricity I used to study late at night. It was a leash made of paper and ink. Meanwhile, Parker's lifestyle was subsidized by the very family fund I was forced to replenish. When he wrecked his second truck, the repair bill was quietly settled, without a word of the discipline my father so loudly preached to me. The injustice reached its most toxic peak in the treatment of Tessa's health. My little sister's asthma was treated as an inconvenience to the family's schedule. I had begged for months for a high-grade air purifier for our attic room, pointing out the dust and mold from the aging roof. Beatrice had sighed, looking at her calendar, and told me that we simply couldn't justify the expense while the church's winter clothing drive was underfunded. "We must look outward, Sutton," she had said, her voice dripping with the fake piety that earned her the Selfless Woman of the Year award. Yet, a week later, I saw a brand new, top-of-the-line nebulizer in Chloe Gable's living room, a gift from St. Beatrice, because Chloe's son had a slight cough. I watched my sister struggle for breath in the damp cold of the attic, while our parents were hailed as heroes for saving the neighbors from a minor chill. This was the structure of our lives. A constant, grinding pressure to prove I was worth the space I occupied while watching the people I was supposed to trust give our survival away to strangers for the sake of an audience. Silas and Beatrice had mastered the art of charity that began anywhere but at home. They had trained me to believe that my worth was zero, that my labor was a debt, and that my sister's safety was a luxury we couldn't afford. They didn't just favor Parker or Chloe. They used my life as the fuel to keep the fires of their public image burning. I had accepted this as normal because I had never known anything else, but as the temperature in the dark hallway began to drop toward the lethal, the normalcy of that injustice finally shattered, leaving behind a cold, sharp clarity that no amount of Beatrice's lies could ever dull again. In that freezing silence, while my parents were miles away performing their charity for a captivated audience, I realized that I possessed a sanctuary they could never touch. For Silas and Beatrice, the world was a stage where every move was choreographed for maximum applause. But for me, the world was a series of systems, data points, and atmospheric pressures. While they saw my internship at the regional meteorology station as a convenient way to keep me out of the house and earning a contribution, for me, it was the only place where truth wasn't negotiable. In the weather station, the barometer didn't care about my father's reputation or my mother's fake smiles. It only cared about the reality of the air. This was my unique light, a professional competence that I had honed in secret, a seed of power that I had planted while they were busy watering their own egos. I wasn't just a difficult face or a financial drain. I was a student of the sky, a person who understood the coming wreckage long before the first board was nailed over my window. I had spent hundreds of hours analyzing the patterns of the Rockies, learning how the wind interacts with the terrain of Silverthorne. I knew that the storm currently screaming against our roof was not the manageable dusting Silas had described to the neighbors. I was a scientist in the making, and my ability to remain steady amidst a crisis was a skill forged in the emergency rooms of my own childhood neglect. However, the true source of my strength, the person who had fueled this light when everyone else tried to extinguish it, was my grandmother, Eleanor Vance. Nana Eleanor was the only person in the Vance bloodline who refused to look at me as a line item on a ledger. She lived in the original homestead, a sturdy blue house that Silas treated like an inevitable inheritance, but she treated it like a fortress for the truth. While my mother was busy taping Caleb's mediocre tests to the fridge, Nana was in her garden, showing me how to read the clouds and telling me that my worth was inherent, not earned. "Sutton," she had told me once, her voice like gravel and wisdom, "the wind doesn't care how loud Silas shouts. It only cares about the structure it hits. Build your own structure, baby. Build it out of things they can't take away." She was the one who encouraged my meteorology studies, seeing it as the tool I needed to navigate a family that operated on smoke and mirrors. She was the one who noticed that Beatrice only bought the snacks Caleb liked, so she kept a jar of my favorite salted caramels in her pantry, a small but definitive act of recognition in a house that thrived on my invisibility. 3 months before she passed away, Nana Eleanor handed me a thick, manila folder. We were sitting on her porch swing, the wood creaking in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. She didn't make a spectacle of it. She just slid it into my lap and covered my hand with hers. Her skin felt like worn parchment, but her grip was as firm as a mountain. "This is the roof that won't leak, Sutton," she whispered, her eyes sharp and clear. Silas thinks he knows the value of this land, but he doesn't understand the value of the person standing on it. When the real storm comes, and you'll know it when you see it, you open this. You don't ask for permission, you just act. At the time, I thought she was just being poetic, a symptom of her aging mind, as Silas often claimed. But as I sat on that closet floor, the thermal layers I'd professionally packed for myself, being the only thing keeping Tessa and me from hypothermia, I realized Nana had been the ultimate meteorologist of our family. She had predicted exactly how Silas and Beatrice would fail me. I reached into the hidden compartment of my backpack and felt the edges of that manila folder. It was my seed of power, the evidence that I wasn't just a victim trapped in a dark house, but a woman with a map to a life they could never control. My light wasn't just my grades or my internship. It was the fact that I had become a person who verified everything twice, a person who understood the triage of survival. While Silas was out playing the hero with a borrowed truck and a fake smile, I was the one who had actually prepared. I had the emergency supplies, the medical knowledge to manage Tessa's asthma, and the data to know exactly how long we had to endure. I wasn't just a daughter they had left behind. I was the only person in Silverthorne who truly knew the architecture of the storm. Silas thought he had locked a frightened girl in a cage, but he had actually trapped a scientist with the keys to his own destruction. Nana Eleanor had seen this moment coming from miles away, and through her, I realized that being invisible was actually my greatest advantage. It meant they never saw the storm I was building in return. The barometric pressure didn't just drop, it plummeted like a stone off a cliff, a mathematical confirmation of the carnage I knew was coming. At the meteorology station, we call this bombogenesis a weather bomb, but in the kitchen of Silverthorne, it was merely the stage for my father's final, most devastating performance. Silas stood there, in his high-visibility rescue parka, the orange fabric glowing under the flickering fluorescent lights, looking every bit the savior the town believed him to be. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised, metallic purple, and the first flakes of the century storm were already beginning to bury the porch step. I held the weather radio in one hand, and Tessa's shivering fingers in the other, trying to explain the triage of the situation that we needed to move now before the mountain passes became impassable. But Silas wasn't listening to me. He was listening to the frantic vibration of his phone. It was Chloe Gable. She was terrified. She was alone, and her furnace had supposedly rattled in a way that made her feel unsafe. I watched my mother, Beatrice, spring into action, her face illuminating with the perverse joy she found in a public emergency. Within 10 minutes, our heavy-duty SUV was packed with Chloe's suitcases and her toddler's designer gear, leaving no room for the two daughters who had lived in the shadows of that house for 18 years. I stood by the mudroom door, my own small duffel bag already packed with Tessa's nebulizer and emergency supplies, waiting for the command to load up. Instead, Beatrice looked at me, then at the two dogs whimpering by the stove, and then back to the car. "Sutton, someone has to be the anchor," she said, her voice dropping into that rehearsed, charitable tone she used at church fundraisers. "The Gables are fragile. Chloe is practically hyperventilating. And we can't leave the pets alone to starve or let thieves pick the house clean after the storm passes." I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound, because I genuinely thought it was a test of my resolve. But Silas didn't smile back. He walked past me into the garage and returned with a stack of plywood and a power drill. The inciting incident of my life didn't happen with a shout. It happened with the rhythmic, industrial scream of a drill. I stood on the porch, clutching Tessa against my ribs, as my father began to board up the windows of our own home from the outside. When I pounded on the glass, asking why he was sealing the exits while we were still inside, he didn't even look at my face. He just kept working, his jaw locked in that heroic grimace. "It's so you don't get any ideas. Once the wind starts howling, Sutton," he shouted over the rising gale. "You're 18. You're the responsible one. Guard the property. We'll be at the Hilton by the interstate if the cell towers hold." He wasn't protecting us. He was securing his assets while disposing of the one he found most inconvenient. He treated our survival like a subscription he could cancel for a few days to save on the cost of his own discomfort. I watched through the last sliver of the kitchen window as they loaded the neighbors' kids into the heated leather seats. Beatrice didn't look back. She was too busy handing a thermos of cocoa to Chloe Gable, playing the Saint of Silverthorn, while her own children were being entombed in ice. The final blow wasn't the plywood. It was the silence that followed the snap of the main breaker. Silas reached for the electrical box on the side of the house, his steady, unshakable hand flipping the switch that plunged us into a total, clinical darkness. "Save the generator for an actual emergency," he called out, his voice already fading into the roar of the blizzard. And then, the sound of the SUV's engine pulled away, the tires crunching over the snow that was rapidly becoming our prison wall. I stood in the center of the pitch-black kitchen, the only sound being the raspy, terrified wheeze of Tessa's breath and the frantic scratching of the dogs against the boarded-up doors. In that moment, I reached the absolute bottom. I was no longer a daughter. I was storm furniture, a warm body left behind to ensure the pipes didn't burst and the hero's property remained intact. The safety my parents preached was a lie they only told to people who didn't live under their roof. They had pushed me into the deepest, coldest part of the dark, thinking the isolation would keep me compliant. But as I felt for the edges of the manila folder Nana Eleanor had hidden for me, I realized Silas had made a fatal miscalculation. He had given me exactly what I needed to dismantle his architecture of deception, 24 hours of uninterrupted silence to finally look at the evidence. The storm hadn't just trapped me. It had cleared the stage for the only truth that mattered. The taillights of my father's SUV didn't just fade into the blizzard, they were swallowed whole, leaving behind a white, swirling void where my sense of security used to be. I stood in the absolute, clinical darkness of our kitchen, my palm pressed against the cold glass of the only window he hadn't yet finished boarding up before his final, hurried exit. The silence that rushed in to fill the vacuum of the engine's roar wasn't peaceful, it was a heavy, suffocating shroud of abandonment. I leaned my forehead against the rough plywood. Silas had hammered over the mudroom door, catching the muffled, distorted remnants of my parents' final exchange before they reached the car. My father's voice, even through the barrier of timber and ice, held that unshakable administrative authority he used when making difficult executive decisions for the county. "Sutton is an anchor, Beatrice," Silas had said, his words landing with the finality of a gavel. "She's built for this. She'll keep an eye on the livestock and ensure the property doesn't sustain unnecessary damage. She's the structural integrity this house needs tonight. Chloe, however, she's fragile. She is a guest in our town, and we cannot allow a guest to face a Category 4 storm in a rattling farmhouse when we have a suite reserved at the Hilton." There was no hesitation in his tone, no tremor of a father's instinct to protect his firstborn. In that moment, the truth that had been whispered behind closed doors for 18 years was finally shouted through the Van Gore. I wasn't his child. I was his security system. I was a strong asset, which in the Vance ledger simply meant I was expendable enough to be left in a lethal blizzard to guard his investments. Beatrice's response was a soft, humming agreement, the sound of a woman who had spent a lifetime rearranging the seating chart of her heart to ensure I was always tucked away at the back, next to the service entrance. "You're right, Silas. It's the most appropriate arrangement. It's for the best," she replied. This wasn't a panicked error made under pressure. It was the most honest thing they had ever done. They weren't saving a neighbor. They were disposing of a daughter they had decided was a financial drain, long before the first snowflake touched the ground. The darkness in the hallway seemed to amplify every sound of the storm, but it couldn't drown out the sharp, terrifying whistle coming from the floor. Tessa was sitting against the linen closet, her small hands clutching her chest as her lungs began to tighten in the dry, freezing air. Without electricity, the high-efficiency air purifier Silas had installed was a dead plastic box, and the backup nebulizer was in the car, buried under Chloe Gable's luggage. "Sutton," Tessa whispered, the word barely a breath of vapor in the cold. "Are they really gone?" I didn't lie to her. I couldn't afford to. "Yes, baby," I said. my voice as flat and clinical as the ice forming on the siding. "It's just us now." I felt the architecture of deception Beatrice had used to wallpaper our lives finally peel away, revealing the rot beneath. This was the final rehearsal of my childhood. Every science fair they skipped, every birthday they forgot now performed on a stage of life and death. I realized then that Silas hadn't boarded the windows to keep the storm out. He had boarded them to keep the truth of what he was doing inside. He wanted to ensure that if the house collapsed, the evidence of his cruelty would be buried under the wreckage. I was storm furniture, a piece of property left in the dark until it was convenient to be used again. My mother had sighed like I was an embarrassment when I asked for a seat in the SUV, as if my desire to breathe was a social faux pas. As I sat there in the dark, holding the emergency inhaler, I'd had the foresight to hide in my pocket, and praying for the 34th minute of that hour, I felt a violent, silent shift within me. The quiet martyr Beatrice had groomed me to be, was dead. The silent sacrifice had reached its expiration date. I didn't cry. I didn't scream for them to come back. I simply sat in the hallway with the pets and my struggling sister, listening to the house groan under the weight of the snow. I smiled a cold, calculated smile, because for the first time in my life, I understood exactly what I was to them. I was the daughter who didn't exist, unless there was a pipe to be fixed or a neighbor to be impressed. But Silas Vance had forgotten one thing about the strong girl he had abandoned. A storm doesn't just destroy, it clears the land. And as my fingers found the heavy edges of Nana Eleanor's manila folder in the dark, I knew that when the sun finally rose, there would be no hero left in Silverthorne. There would only be the wreckage he left behind, and I would be the one holding the inventory. The darkness inside the house had become a physical weight, a cold, airless pressure that felt like it was trying to collapse my lungs in sympathy with Tessa's. I sat on the floor of the hallway closet, the only place sheltered from the icy drafts, screaming through the rafters, and clutched the manila folder to my chest, as if the paper itself could generate heat. Tessa's breathing had transitioned from a whistle to a ragged, desperate rasp. A sound I knew from my medical training signaled the final stages of an airway, closing under the stress of the freezing, dry air. I had used the last of the emergency inhaler, and as the clock on my dead phone remained a black mirror, I realized we were no longer just waiting out a storm. We were being erased by it. This was the moment I reached the absolute bottom, a traumatic state of helplessness, where the only things keeping us alive were my thermal gear and the sheer, stubborn will to see the sun rise. The sound of the rescue didn't start with a siren. It started with the rhythmic, violent thud of a heavy tool meeting the plywood Silas had nailed over the mudroom door. In the silence of our tomb, the noise was tectonic. Then came the unmistakable screech of nails being ripped from wood, the sound of the architecture of deception finally being pried open by the hands of someone who actually cared about survival. I didn't scream. I didn't have the breath left. I simply pushed the closet door open and watched as a beam of light, sharp and clinical, sliced through the shadows. Chief Sterling Miller stepped into the kitchen at exactly 4:17 a.m., his heavy boots crunching on the frost that had formed on the linoleum. He didn't look like the friendly man who used to share coffee with Nana Eleanor. He looked like a soldier entering a disaster zone. Behind him, I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the whiteout conditions outside, a moral rescue force that Silas hadn't anticipated. Sterling had been out on patrol, verifying that the mandatory evacuation was complete, when he noticed the plywood, on our windows, was nailed in a way that violated every fire safety protocol in the county. "Sutton? Sutton? Are you in here?" His voice boomed, thick with the gravel of a man who had spent 30 years seeing the worst of Silverthorne. When he found us in the hallway, his eyes went straight to the boards on the windows, then to the main breaker Silas had flipped, and finally to Tessa, whose face had taken on a faint, terrifying shade of blue. He didn't ask where Silas was, he already knew. He scooped Tessa up in one arm and grabbed my shoulder with the other, his grip firm and warm, a triage of safety that my own father had denied us. As we were ushered toward the waiting cruiser, I saw a figure standing on the porch of the house across the street, illuminated by a spotlight. It was Mrs. Higgins, the town librarian. She wasn't just watching, she was holding a professional-grade camcorder, the red recording light a tiny, vengeful eye in the blizzard. She had been filming since the moment Silas pulled the plywood out of his truck. She had recorded the hero of Silverthorne sealing his daughters into a dark house before driving away with the neighbor. She was the witness Silas had forgotten to account for, the one who would ensure his story could never be retold without a footnote of cruelty. The drive to the station was a blur of thermal blankets and the smell of wet wool, but the quiet martyr Beatrice had tried to raise was already being replaced by the record keeper Nana Eleanor had seen in me. Chief Miller didn't waste time with platitudes. He sat me down in his office, handed me a cup of black coffee, and opened an incident report, the first official timestamp in the collapse of the Vance legacy. He boarded them from the outside, Sutton, Miller said, his voice low and dangerous as he typed. Under Colorado's emergency statutes and county fire codes, that isn't securing a property. That's felony endangerment. Especially with the power cut and a known medical condition in the house. He looked at me, waiting for me to defend them. Waiting for the obedience Beatrice had spent 18 years drilling into my spine. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag, pulled out the manila folder, and set it on his desk beside the incident report. He didn't just leave us to guard the house. Chief, I said, my voice steady, stripped of the guilt that used to be my primary language. He left us because the storm provided the perfect cover to ensure I'd never ask questions about Nana Eleanor's real will. Chief Miller stopped typing. The hum of the station's generator filled the room, a stark contrast to the freezing silence Silas had left me in. In that office, surrounded by the documentation of my own survival, the alliance of justice began to form. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a witness with a timeline and a granddaughter with a legacy to reclaim. Silas thought he had buried the truth under a Category 4 storm, but he had only succeeded in stripping away the house's exterior until only the rot remained for the whole town to see. The rescue force was here, but the real storm, the one I was about to unleash with the contents of that folder, was only just beginning. The fluorescent lights of the Silverthorne police station hummed with a clinical, unyielding frequency that seemed to vibrate inside my very bones. Tessa was finally asleep in a small cot in the corner of Chief Miller's office, her breathing assisted by a high-grade medical nebulizer that actually worked. For the first time in 24 hours, the immediate threat of death had receded, leaving behind a cold, hollow space where my adrenaline used to be. I sat at Miller's scarred wooden desk. The manila folder Nana Eleanor had left me resting on the blotter. My hands were no longer shaking, but they felt heavy, like lead weights. I realized then that my father hadn't just left us in the storm to save a neighbor. He had left us because a storm provides the ultimate erasure. If we hadn't made it, the records I was about to examine would have remained buried forever under the wreckage of a tragic accident. I broke the wax seal on the final envelope inside the folder. The paper was heavy, high-quality stock that felt alien in a house where my own school supplies were always bought from the clearance bin. This was the second secret Nana had warned me about, the financial rot that Silas and Beatrice had built their entire public image upon. As I spread the documents out under the harsh LED light, I didn't find a simple, sentimental letter. I found a paper trail of a systematic heist. The first document was a deed of transfer, dated 6 months before Nana Eleanor passed away. It was clean, legally sound, and recorded by a private attorney in Denver. It stated that the Silverthorne homestead, the land Silas claimed was his rightful inheritance, had already been transferred entirely into my name. Nana hadn't just left me the house in a future will, she had given it to me while she was still alive. She had made me the sole owner of the Vance estate the moment I turned 18, a move designed to protect the land from Silas's mounting desperation. But as I flipped to the second set of papers, the second betrayal finally stood revealed in black and white. There was a power of attorney form, dated only 3 weeks ago. My name was at the bottom, my signature written in a cursive that looked almost exactly like mine. But I recognized the slight tremor in the S, a trace of my father's own handwriting that he couldn't quite mask. He had forged my signature. Using that fraudulent document, Silas had walked into a local bank and taken out a massive mortgage against the property, $280,000 cash in hand. I leaned back, the air in the room suddenly feeling as thin as it had in the attic. The money hadn't gone toward the family fund Beatrice preached about. It hadn't gone toward Tessa's medical bills or my tuition. I found a series of wire transfer receipts tucked behind the mortgage papers. Every cent had been funneled into private accounts to settle the gambling debts Parker had accumulated in Denver and to fund Silas's unauthorized campaign for the county board. He had leveraged my future and Tessa's home to pay for the sins of his favorite nephew and the vanity of his own public image. He didn't just leave you to freeze, Sutton. Chief Miller's voice cut through my thoughts. He was leaning against the doorframe, a fresh pot of coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on the forged signature I was staring at. He left you because he needed you to be missing or incapacitated long enough for the bank's final verification period to pass. If the storm had taken you, no one would have ever questioned that signature. It would have been just another part of the Vance tragedy. The realization was a jagged shard of ice in my chest. Silas hadn't just been a negligent father. He had been a predator. He had boarded up my windows not to keep the wind out, but to ensure that if the house collapsed, I would be found in a place that suggested I was hiding, not trying to escape with these documents. He had gambled with our lives to protect a lie. He had spent 18 years calling me a financial drain while he was actively draining the only real legacy we had. I looked at the timestamps on the mortgage recording. He had filed the final paperwork on the very morning the storm warnings reached Category 4. He knew the blizzard was coming. He had checked the barometric pressure just like I had, but he didn't see it as a threat. He saw it as an opportunity. He saw the snow as a white sheet he could pull over his crimes. He thinks he's the only one who knows how to use a storm, Chief, I said, my voice dropping into a register I didn't recognize, a cold, calculated tone that matched the weather outside. But he forgot that I'm the one who actually studies the data. He thinks he's erased me, but all he's done is give me the silence I needed to build a case he can't outrun. I reached for the pen on Miller's desk and began to annotate the documents, creating a timeline of the forgery. I was no longer the girl who begged for a seat in the car. I was the owner of the house my father was currently sleeping in, a house he had stolen, leveraged, and abandoned. Silas Vance had spent my whole quirk dough, making me feel like a guest in my own skin, but as I looked at the deed Nana had secured for me, I realized I was finally the one holding the keys. The second twist wasn't just that he was a thief. It was that he was a thief who had stolen from a daughter who now had the legal power to dismantle his entire world. I wasn't going to just tell the town what he did. I was going to show them the receipts, one forged signature at a time. The storm hadn't ended. It was just changing direction, and this time, the Vance hero was the only one standing in its path. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the freezing night and the discovery of the forgery didn't dissipate. It crystallized into a cold, tactical patience. I realized that an emotional outburst at the police station would only play into the dramatic girl narrative Silas and Beatrice had spent 18 years perfecting. Instead, I chose the path of the strategist, the meteorologist who waits for the atmospheric conditions to align before the storm makes its move. I didn't confront my father immediately. I didn't even answer his frantic texts. I spent the next 3 days in the quiet, sterile guest room of Chief Miller's house, meticulously building my architecture of truth. My first call was to Marcus Thorne, the man Nana Eleanor had called the only wolf in Denver with a conscience. Thorne was a legacy attorney, a specialist in estate fraud, who didn't care about my father's public hero status. He only cared about the ink on the page. When he arrived at the station, his presence was a stark contrast to the small-town familiarity of Silverthorne. He dressed in charcoal gray suits that felt like armor, and spoke in the precise, rhythmic cadence of a man who viewed the law as a structural science. We sat at a corner table in a local diner, a place where the smell of burnt coffee and the hum of the heater provided a backdrop for the dismantling of my parents' lives. Thorne laid out the weapons I had gathered. The original deed Nana had filed, the forged power of attorney Silas had used to leverage the mortgage, and the incident report Chief Miller had time-stamped with clinical accuracy. He committed a double fraud, Sutton, Thorne said, his voice as steady as a metronome. The forgery is the criminal act, but the occupancy violation and the life-threatening conditions he created are the moral weight that will ensure he can't negotiate his way out of this. We spent hours cross-referencing the mortgage recording date with the local weather alerts. The data didn't lie. Silas had filed for the cash exactly 48 hours before he boarded up my windows. He hadn't left us to guard his house. He had left us to ensure we wouldn't interfere with the bank's final confirmation call. But gathering the documents wasn't enough. I needed a stage. I needed a venue where his public image was at its peak, so that the collapse would be absolute. Chief Miller handed me a flyer that had been circulating throughout the county. The Silverthorne Community Recognition Gala. It was scheduled for Saturday night. Silas Vance, the hero of the Great Blizzard, was to receive a commemorative plaque for his selfless evacuation of the Gable family. It was the ultimate irony, a platform built on the very lie that had almost cost Tessa her life. "That's where we do it," I said, the words feeling like a door clicking into place. "He wants an audience to validate his sacrifice? I'll give him an audience that will witness his confession." I wasn't acting out of a desire for a sentimental reconciliation or a messy shouting match. I was acting with the record-keeper discipline I had learned at the weather station. I reached out to Mrs. Higgins, the librarian who had filmed Silas from across the street. She didn't hesitate. She handed me a thumb drive containing the unedited footage of Silas hammering the plywood over my bedroom window while the dogs whimpered inside. Over the next 48 hours, I organized the folder into a digital presentation. I had the weather reports, the medical records from Tessa's emergency treatment at the station, the forged deed, and the video evidence. I rehearsed my speech not for its emotional impact, but for its factual density. Beatrice had taught me that silence was my duty. I was about to teach her that silence is also the best place to hide a bomb. I called my father once on Friday night. I didn't yell. I didn't even mention the storm. I just told him I was feeling better, and that Tessa and I would be at the gala to see him receive his award. I could hear the relief in his voice, the sound of a man who thought he had successfully managed the wreckage. "That's my girl," he said, the old manipulative warmth returning to his tone. "I knew you were strong enough to move past it. We're a family, Sutton. We look forward, not back." I hung up and looked at the manila folder sitting on the table. He thought the gala was a finish line. He thought he had outrun the debt he owed us. But I was no longer the financial drain he had left in the dark. I was the owner of the house he claimed as his own, and I was the architect of the reality that was about to crush him. This wasn't revenge, it was a recovery of sovereignty. Saturday night wasn't just a party. It was the arrival of the cold front. Silas Vance had never bothered to forecast. I checked the barometric pressure one last time. It was rising. The stage was set. The Silverthorne Community Ballroom was a sea of shimmering crystal, expensive wool suits, and the heavy, cloying scent of roast beef and professional success. This was the stage Silas and Beatrice had lived for, a venue where their public reputation could be polished to a blinding shine. I stood at the back of the room, my black slacks and white button-down, feeling like a uniform of war amidst the gowns and tuxedos. I still looked like someone who had been hit by a truck because I had been the faint yellowing of the bruise on my jaw serving as a physical timestamp of the blizzard Silas claimed to have conquered. My father was at the podium, basking in the spotlight. He wore the persona of the weary hero, his shoulders slightly hunched as if burdened by the weight of his own selflessness. He had just accepted a glass plaque for his extraordinary courage in evacuating the Gable family. "We don't do this for the recognition," Silas said into the microphone, his voice rich with that practiced, humble tremor that had fooled this town for 2 decades. "We do it because in Silverthorne, we are a family. We look out for our neighbors. We protect the vulnerable." The room erupted in warm, genuine applause, a collective validation of the lie. That was the moment I chose to reclaim the right to tell the story, to strip away his narrative and replace it with the cold, hard data of reality. I didn't shout. I didn't run. I walked toward the stage with the measured, rhythmic pace of a professional responding to a medical code. The conversations didn't die all at once. They faded table by table as I climbed the stairs, my presence a jagged, unpolished edge in their perfect evening. "Dad," I said, my voice clear and level through the speakers as I reached for the microphone. Silas didn't resist. He couldn't, not with 120 pairs of expectant eyes watching him play the supporting role for his miracle daughter. He stepped aside with a confident, manipulative smile, likely expecting a daughterly tribute. Instead, I turned to the audience. "Thank you all for being here," I began, the microphone warm from my father's grip. "I'm Sutton Vance, and while my father has been hailed as a hero tonight, I think this community deserves to hear the full story of what happened behind those boarded windows." The room went still, that pressurized silence that precedes a lightning strike. I adjusted the projector remote in my hand, and the large screen behind the podium flickered to life. "This morning, I found a video," I said, as Mrs. Higgins' footage began to play. The ballroom watched in a collective, horrified gasp as the screen showed Silas Vance, the man they had just applauded, hammering heavy plywood over my bedroom window from the outside. They heard the industrial scream of the drill. They heard the muffled whimpering of our dogs, and Tessa's terrified voice asking why we were being locked in. Then, they saw Silas reach for the breaker box and flip the switch, plunging the house and his daughters into a lethal darkness. "He didn't leave us to guard the property," I stated, my voice as flat and factual as reading a weather report. "He left us because a Category 4 storm provides the ultimate cover for a man who has something to hide." I clicked the remote again, and Nana Eleanor's deed appeared, followed by the forged power of attorney with my father's trembling cursive masquerading as my own. While I was trapped in that dark hallway, my father used this forged document to take out a $280,000 mortgage against my inheritance. I continued. The records, now visible to every donor and board member in the room. That money didn't go to the community. It went to pay off gambling debts in Denver. He boarded those windows to ensure that if the storm took us, the truth about this heist would be buried under the wreckage of a tragic accident. The moral deconstruction was total. I watched the color leave Silas's face, his hero mask cracking in real time as he looked around for an ally. But there were no friendly faces left. I saw the mayor's wife put down her wine glass with an expression of pure disgust. I saw Chief Miller standing by the door, his hand resting on his belt, his presence a silent confirmation of the incident report I had filed. Silas opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time in his adult life, nothing came out. He wasn't just losing an award, he was losing his sovereignty over the town's respect. Beatrice sat at the front table, her chin lifted, but her fingers were white as they gripped her champagne flute, a ceramic facade that was shattering one document at a time. "I'm not here for revenge, Silas," I said, setting the microphone down on the stand with a soft, definitive click. "I'm here because Nana Eleanor told me that the truth cares about structure. You built a life out of plywood and lies, but I've spent my life studying the storm, and the storm is finally here." I stepped off the stage, leaving my father standing in the silence of his own, making a man who had traded his daughters for a $280,000 debt and a plaque he no longer had the right to hold. The silence that followed the gala was not the end of the storm. It was the arrival of a clinical, irreversible demolition. Silas and Beatrice had spent 2 decades building an architecture of deception, but they had failed to account for the fact that a structure built on a frozen lake eventually meets the spring. As the record keeper Nana Eleanor had raised me to be, I watched the fallout from a distance, documenting the chain reaction of consequences as it moved through our lives with the precision of a cold front. Consequences, I realized, do not always come with the theatrical flair of a microphone. More often, they arrive with a series of quiet, devastating phone calls on a Monday morning. By 9:00 a.m. the following Monday, the Silverthorne County Board had received the footage from Mrs. Higgins. Silas was not just asked to step back, He was immediately suspended from the county maintenance department pending a formal investigation into abuse of official power and resources. The man who prided himself on securing the perimeter of our town was now the one being barred from his own office, his access badge deactivated as if he were a security threat, which, as the records now proved, he was. The financial payoff, extended payoff, was even more absolute. Attorney Marcus Thorne had contacted the fraud department at the Bank of Colorado before the gala's echoes had even died down. Once they reviewed the original deed and the clinical evidence of the forged power of attorney, the $280,000 mortgage wasn't just disputed, it was frozen. Silas had already funneled a significant portion of that money to settle Parker's gambling debts in Denver, thinking he was protecting the family legacy. Now, the bank was calling in the entire balance, and because the loan was based on a fraudulent title, Silas was personally liable for every cent. He had sold our future for a few months of silence, and now the debt was screaming for a settlement he couldn't afford. Beatrice's world collapsed in a different, more social, moral deconstruction. The church board at St. Jude, the very people who had once hailed her as the selfless woman of the year, met behind closed doors on Tuesday evening. They didn't need a court ruling to see the evil in boarding up children during a mandatory evacuation. Beatrice wasn't just invited to leave the charity board, she was erased from the community program. I heard through Mrs. Higgins that even Chloe Gable, the neighbor my parents had sacrificed us to save, had packed her belongings and moved to her sister's house in Boulder. Chloe was a fragile guest, but she wasn't a fool. She knew that being associated with the Vances was now a social contagion. The most satisfying twist came from the accomplice, my cousin Parker. When the police opened the formal investigation into forgery and fraud, Parker realized that Silas's hero status wouldn't protect him from the Denver creditors or the county prosecutor. He called me from a burner phone, his voice shaking, a stark contrast to the arrogant golden boy Silas had groomed. He admitted that Silas had coached him on how to handle the bank's verification calls if they ever came. Parker wasn't a mastermind. He was just a weak, greedy link in my father's chain, and he broke the moment the legal heat was applied. I watched through the digital timestamps of the case files as my father's authority withered. Chief Miller had served him with a summons for felony endangerment of a minor and forgery in the 3rd degree. For the first time in my life, I saw Silas Vance look smaller than I had ever imagined. He sat in the station's interview room, the same man who had once loomed over me like a titan, now staring at his hands as Miller read him the incident report. There were no speeches left. No charismatic reframing, only the naked truth of a man who had gambled his daughter's lives for a seat at the mayor's table. The karma didn't stop at the legal filings. The hero of Silverthorne had lost the only thing he truly valued, the power to tell the story. The town members who had once clinked glasses with him now crossed the street to avoid him. He had spent 18 years treating me like an expendable asset, but as the county prosecutor prepared the case, Silas realized that I was the only person in Silverthorne with a verified timeline. This wasn't a messy, sentimental revenge. It was the architectural failure of a life built on plywood and pride. Every document, every video clip, and every frozen bank account was a brick falling from the facade he had tried to trap me behind. The storm had cleared the land, and as Silas Vance stood in the rubble, he finally understood that the person he had left in the dark was the only one who truly knew where all the bodies and the bills were buried. The spring thaw in Silverthorne arrived not with a roar, but with a quiet, persistent drip of melting ice from the eaves of the homestead. I stood on the porch of the Silverthorne property, the same wood where Silas had hammered the plywood just months ago, and watched as the last of the century snow retreated into the earth. The house no longer looked like a tomb. With the boards removed and the windows cleaned of their frozen grime, it finally looked like a home again. The legal battle had been a clinical demolition of my father's facade, but the restoration of my sovereignty was a much quieter process. It took exactly 3 months for the court to finalize the voiding of the fraudulent deed. My attorney, Marcus Thorne, had called me on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week Silas had once flipped the breaker, to confirm that the title was back in my name, solely and irrevocably. The $280,000 mortgage Silas had leveraged had been legally decoupled from the property, leaving the debt to follow him like a shadow into his new, much smaller life in another county. I didn't feel the hot revenge people describe in movies. I felt a steady, structural relief, as if a load-bearing wall had finally been properly reinforced. Silas and Beatrice were gone. They had moved into a two-bedroom apartment near the interstate, a place where no one knew Silas as a hero and where Beatrice had no boards to preside over. They sent letters occasionally, filled with the same sentimental manipulation and fake piety they had used for years, begging for a reconciliation dinner or a chance to explain the pressure they were under. I didn't burn the letters, but I didn't reply to them either. I placed them in a file labeled correspondence. Terminated, a clinical boundary that ensured they could no longer dictate the narrative of my life. Forgiveness without accountability is just permission for the next cruelty, I reminded myself, a lesson I had learned while sitting in a hallway closet with a suffocating sister. Tessa was different now, too. She no longer flinched at the sound of a hammer or the flicker of a light. We had moved her room from the drafty attic down to the sun-drenched guest suite, the one Silas had once reserved for Parker. She had a top-of-the-line air filtration system and a medical nebulizer that never lacked power. Watching her play in the garden Nana Eleanor had loved was the only payoff I truly cared about. I had used a portion of the inheritance to set up an emergency weather-ready fund for the town, ensuring that other invisible children would have a safe place to go when the sky turned purple. I stood in the kitchen and set the table for dinner. 4 plates, 1 for me, 1 for Tessa, and 2 for Chief Miller and Mrs. Higgins, the chosen family who had seen us when our own blood had trained themselves to look away. There was no string quartet, no expensive catering, and no appearances to maintain. There was only the scent of pine and the sound of the dishwasher humming a steady, domestic electricity that Silas had once tried to weaponize against us. I realized then that Silas hadn't just left me in a storm. He had given me the chance to build a life where the windows would never be boarded again. I wasn't a financial drain or a storm furniture anymore. I was a scientist, a homeowner, and a protector. I walked to the breaker box, the one Silas had flipped in a final act of abandonment, and saw that Chief Miller had replaced it with a modern, transparent housing. My name is Sutton Vance, and I live in a house with white shutters and a porch swing that squeaks in the wind. The air is clear, the title is clean, and for the first time in 18 years, the door is locked from the inside by me. I don't look back for the taillights of an SUV that will never return. I look forward, at a table where everyone belongs, and where nobody, absolutely nobody, is ever left sitting next to the trash. That is not revenge. That is architecture.